yet I'm not going to give up on being a good person, right? Like he's saying, I'm keeping my upward aim. I don't care what's happening. Shouldn't a downtrodden man be allowed to strive for righteousness too? I know God's going to save me. I know he's going to do it even if I die, but I don't know how.
Yeah, that's like I have a friend who may or may not be listening to this. And his little girl, when she was about 5, asked him, "How do we get to heaven?" And he's like, "Okay, whoa, I mean, that's a big question." So he starts trying to put it in 5-year-old terms, and he just watched her eyes glass over, and she goes, "Does he fly us there?" And he was like, "Yeah, that'll work for now. Just trust him, just trust him, and he'll figure it out."
Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy,
And I'm Caleb.
and you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we discuss biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Today, we are continuing our series, Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? And in this episode, we're going to talk about the Old Testament book of Job. And in the Old Testament, we're going to discuss how Job conceives of resurrection and redemption. So it's going to be pretty remarkable theology. And then we're going to move into the New Testament, and we're going to see that those two themes obviously continue there with the life and ministry and work of Jesus Christ, resurrection and redemption both. And we're going to also see the end of death. So that'll be kind of a cool thing. So, Caleb, we've been talking about the post-exilic Israel period here recently. We've been spent a lot of time in the Persian Empire, and in this episode, we're making a huge break because we're going to go back and talk about wisdom literature.
Yeah.
And, that was a favorite of King Solomon. And so it's kind of tricky. Like, how old is the book of Job? How old is the material inside the book of Job? Because we know that some stories were carried around as oral traditions for centuries, even. And so Job may be one of those stories. Maybe it was carried through all different cultures of the area of the Semitic peoples and finally gets written down. We don't really know when, and we don't know by who, but maybe sometime during Solomon's reign or sometime in the post-exilic period, it got written down. But we know it's much older than that. So you're the historian. How could Job be older than, say, like the creation story?
Well, we know that in the ancient world, literacy was rare. Most people were illiterate. So most information was passed down in oral traditions. So when we say Job is older than the creation story, we mean that the Israelites were telling that story longer than they were telling the creation story.
Potentially, right?
So they might have either forgotten or not been given that kind of information. The tradition holds that Moses was given the creation story and the flood story, all of that narrative, as he was given the rest of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
so it's thought, and there are ways that they try to figure that out based on writing style or references that are made compared with other texts, and even outside of the Hebrew tradition compared with other Semitic or Near Eastern texts and myths to try to date the story.
yeah, yeah. One reason, for instance, that people would say Job's older than say Moses is because it talks about sacrifice, but it doesn't talk about priests. And so
Mm,
Job's doing all of his own sacrificing, it looks like. And so
yeah,
that's kind of an interesting wrinkle. But, you
it
could
kind of
also,
sounds like Abraham and Noah. Like
yeah,
they offer things to God, but they just
yeah.
do it themselves.
But you could also say, well, they wrote it that way on purpose to make it sound old. But in any case, it does have elements that would predate the law, for instance. Um, some other interesting things with how these stories were passed down and whatnot is that there were diplomatic languages that were typically the ones that were written. And so where in a king's court, they had to write down records, they had to write down, property transactions, histories of the kings and so on. And they used the diplomatic languages of the time. And so those were the only people who really needed to know how to read and write.
Yeah,
Like you were saying, the typical person couldn't afford paper for one thing because it was extremely expensive to produce papyrus or any other kind of writing medium back then, whether it was like vellum or whatever. I mean, that they weren't even developed until later on. So,
mhm.
At this time, your options for writing were expensive and very limited.
Clay tablets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, of course, yeah. The cuneiform script was written on clay, and that was the first written languages that we still have preserved today, written with a stylus in
Hmm.
wet clay, and then fired in the furnaces, which is actually why they had furnaces in the stories where we see like Daniel in the fiery furnace and
Hmm.
things like that. Okay, so that was some of the reasons why this could be very ancient literature. Um, we know that say both the creation story and Job would have circulated as oral traditions for a long time before they were written down. And the question would be, well, like what would men of antiquity have pondered first? Would they have thought about ultimate suffering, like in the case of Job? Would that have bothered them more, or would, hey, where did we come from, bother them more?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know.
Yeah,
I would wonder about both.
yeah,
Suffering is kind of difficult to ignore, though. So
yeah. I mean, every life has suffering in it, right? But not everybody has to sit around and ponder, wait, where did I come from? Like generations past.
yeah,
Sometimes you're just trying to make it, hand to mouth.
yeah. More often, it's more pertinent to figure out how you're gonna get through the day than to figure out
Yeah.
everything originated from.
So, regardless of all the things we just discussed, it's kind of indeterminate, like which one's older, Genesis or Job. Um, but like we said, Job could have been recorded, written down at least as early as Solomon, because we know he liked to collect wisdom literature, and as the Proverbs testify, and so he might have said, "Hey, that's a cool story. Let's make sure we
Yeah,
get that written down and recorded here in my court." So,
that seems like it would fit.
yeah, yeah. So, speaking of ultimate suffering in the book of Job, like we can't read the whole thing. It's 40 chapters long. Hopefully, you've read it before, or you would love to read it. You might want to pause and take a week and read it, and then come back to the podcast. But we're going to give you a basic plot line of the book of Job, and the very first thing about the plot of Job that you need to recognize comes in the very first verse, and that is that Job is an upright man.
Yes, that's true. And did we mention this is it's a book of poetry?
Yeah, it's written
We
in
mentioned, yeah,
verse.
it's written as a poem
Mm.
in Hebrew, and that sometimes can be hard to see through translation. But it's not written as a historic account. Most people don't think that it is. Didn't even necessarily think that it was then. It was written as kind of like this myth to teach you a lesson,
Yeah, I mean it's
like
also,
Homer's epic poems too.
well, it's written in an accessible, everyman kind of voice too, to where I mean we've all feel like we've suffered unjustly in our lives at
Hmm.
times, and so we can all relate to Job. But one of the reasons it's written in poetic verse is because it was an oral tradition, right? And that was the way people memorized
Yes,
things.
yeah,
You wrote it in verse. It has a rhyme to it. It has a meter
yeah.
to it.
If you
You go,
can't,
oh, I remember the next line because it's like a song, right?
yeah, if you can't write, then it's easy to remember things with rhymes or with not every language uses rhyme, but with some kind of
Meter.
poetic tricks, lyric qualities.
Yeah, alliteration.
I mean, think about nursery rhymes.
Yeah,
You still know them today, even if you haven't sung one for 50 years.
yeah, like in Psalm 119, where every stanza, every sentence begins with the same letter.
Hmm.
Kind of goes through the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, so that's all cool stuff. So, but the first thing we wanted to say was in Job 1, also in Job 8, also in Job 2, verse 3, they all say that Job was an upright man, and even God says that he was.
Yeah.
So, so that is a key to understanding this book, that Job is an upright man. So that's how we open, and hopefully most of us feel that way, like we're trying to do the right thing. So we can relate to Job. He's trying to do the right thing.
Yes. I want to circle back to that later. Don't let me forget. Like one at the end of the lesson.
Okay.
The
Okay.
I want that to hang in everyone's mind and wonder what makes him upright. Because I'm sure he's not perfect, right? Like
Sure,
all
he's
of
not.
us.
No, but he's trying to. Okay, so this attracts the attention not only of God, as we mentioned in verse 8 and verse 3 of chapter 2. God recognizes Job as upright, but it also attracts the attention of Satan. And he
Yeah.
he comes and talks to God in Job 1:9 through 11, and he said, which we're not going to read. Okay, you need to do a lot of homework on this one. But he basically says, well, yeah, the only reason that Job is good is because you've blessed him, and if I took all that away from him, he'd curse you.
Yeah, keep in mind Satan, his name means the accuser. We talked about that in the Nehemiah episode where we looked at how God silences our accusers.
Hmm.
And it's interesting that he is the first really mover in the story, in possibly the oldest story that's told in the Bible.
Yeah,
Because a
yeah,
lot of people treat Satan or the idea of Satan as something that developed later, especially a lot of biblical critics.
yeah.
But Satan or something, very similar is there apparently in the oldest story that the Israelites were telling.
Now remember, we're only picking one attribute or characteristic or quality of God that we learn from each book. And so every one of the things we're about to mention in the plot of Job is probably something we could spend an entire
Yeah,
hour talking about. But so Job's upright. Satan doesn't think he really is. It's just because God's blessed him, and he gets permission from God in chapter 1 verse 12 through chapter 2 verse 10. God gives him permission to go ahead and test him. And so Satan goes out and just ruins Job's whole life. I mean, he
it's
kills his kids,
yeah,
he knocks down his barns, he
all of his livestock. It's almost comical if it weren't so tragic.
yeah.
It's one after another. A servant comes running to him saying, "Oh, everything's gone and everyone's dead,
Mhm.
and I'm the only one who survived to tell you." And it says while he was still speaking, another servant comes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's built that way. The story. It's almost funny
Yeah.
how just
Yeah.
sudden everything
Well, and,
is.
and it isn't a progression. And also, God had limited Satan the first round of attacks. It said, just don't touch the man
Yeah.
himself. And then the second one, well, Satan says, well, yeah, sure, you didn't let me touch him. So then he lets him attack him with diseases and all kinds of things.
Mhm.
And so Job's he's a pitiful wreck. At the end, it says he's scraping the
Yeah.
sores off of
He's
his.
sitting on the ashes of his home,
Yeah.
scraping his sores with like
Yeah.
pottery shards.
Yeah. So,
And does it say the dogs? No, I'm thinking of
no, that's Lazarus.
Lazarus.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So here's another interesting thing that's just to observe from what's happened so far is Job loses everything except for his life and his wife, right? Not to continue the theme of poetic,
yeah.
memorization there, but Job loses everything but his life and his wife.
Well, and if you
And
read the story and you see how his wife wants him to deal with everything, that seems like it wasn't actually a blessing.
it was another punishment. Yeah, possibly.
Which,
She's like, curse
a
God
lot
and
of
die, she tells him.
yeah, a lot of jokes we can make about that, but
Yeah.
remember, it's a fictional story, honey. Uh,
That was nice.
real
Nice
wives are
knowing you,
not like
son.
that, of course.
All right. So then the real meat of this book, okay, is between chapter 2, verse 11, and um, well, okay. Initially, Job's friends come to comfort him, and for the first 10 or so verses, 2:11 through 2:13, they just comfort him by sitting next to him quietly,
Yeah,
which is really nice.
for days on end.
Yeah.
I think about that a lot. I think sometimes, you want to say something when somebody's hurting. Sometimes you
Mhm.
just need to shut up.
Yeah.
you
And
you can't
Job's
say
friends
anything to make
should
it
have
better.
asked you, should we just keep shutting up?
Yeah.
But instead, for chapters 3 through 37, they decide to get into a dialogue with Job. And this is a 42 chapter book. Okay. So
And about
almost,
40 of the chapters almost are.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just Job and his friends going back and forth. And so again, it's very entertaining. It's very entertaining, but it's just it's kind of painful to listen to the way his friends talk to him. And Job keeps appealing, I want to talk to God. I want to talk to God. And so then in chapters 38 through 41, God responds to Job, kind of, kind of,
Y-
kind of upbraids him for the things he said, but also affirms him as still an upright guy.
Yeah.
And and then in chapter 42, at the end of the book, Job's restored to even greater wealth and prosperity than he had before.
Mhm.
So that's kind of how the book breaks down.
Yeah, that's the basic plot. But we're going to focus specifically
Mhm.
on Job's appeals to God.
Yeah, we want to go through the book. So we do want to kind of go through and give a spattering of the things Job says. We're not going to talk about the things his friends say because all the things that his friends say are discredited by God later on.
Yeah, they don't
So
really matter.
yeah, but but Job has some pretty brilliant stuff that he says. If you consider that this book is one of the oldest pieces of literature available, and widely in everybody's homes, almost everybody's got a Bible in their house. I
If
would
you
guess.
don't,
If you
just
don't,
go to the nearest church. They probably have 100.
that's true. And also the internet, you
Yeah.
got the Bible just for free right there. But in as you look through it, you get to see, that Job has a really strong understanding, a very almost New Testament sounding understanding of things. And this is possibly before most of the Old Testament's even written. He sounds more like the New Testament than the rest of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So let's look at one example in Job 12, verses 13 and 14. And Job is responding to his friends as usual in this whole discourse. He says, "To God belong wisdom and power, counsel and understanding are his. What he tears down cannot be rebuilt. Those he imprisons cannot be released." So,
Well, keep in mind what position Job's in. He's just been torn down.
yeah.
Everything he had has been torn down, and he's
Hmm.
saying, if God wants it that way, there's nothing anyone can do about it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, and he also says, like, in the way he phrases this, he has wisdom and power and counsel and understanding. And all that's God. So you can't outsmart him. You can't outpower him. You can't outmaneuver God, right?
Mhm.
So Job's like, I'm not trying to do any of that. I just want to be able to, talk. I just want to be
Yeah.
able to say what my position is, and plead. So so we're limited and God is not. That's basically what Job's saying
Mhm.
there, right? All right. So continuing on into the next chapter. Um, so Job is having this battle with his friends, and so he wants to tell them, stop trying to talk for God,
Yeah.
basically. And he's like, nobody can speak for God. All I'm saying is I'd like to be able to speak for myself. And
Yeah,
so
they're all trying to speak for God. He just wants to speak to God.
yeah, and pretty much all of chapter 13, that's what it's about. And so here's two excerpts from the chapter to give you kind of a feel for what Job's saying. In Job 13, 7 through 8, Job says, "Will you speak wickedly on God's behalf? Will you speak deceitfully for him? Will you show him partiality? Will you argue the case for God?" And he's telling his friends, like, who are you to say what God thinks about stuff, right?
When you listen to all the language through here, remember Satan is the accuser in Hebrew. So the first thing in the book is an accuser comes against Job, and here he's talking about showing partiality and arguing a case. I mean, there's a lot of kind of a legal
Yeah.
sounding
Hmm.
language here, which has that kind of imagery is retained all down through the Christian tradition as well,
Yeah.
in ways that we think about our dealing with God.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Why don't you read Job 13, 15, and 16?
Okay. Though he slay me, yet I will hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face. Indeed, this will turn out for my deliverance, for no godless person would dare come before him.
So this is the beginning of Job talking about how death is not to be considered in any of your arguments.
Yeah.
Even if you follow God all the way, you're all in, is what Job's basically
Mhm.
saying. I'm all in. I know I'm in a tough spot, but I'm all in. I mean, if God killed me, I'd still be all in. Kind of cool.
Yeah. Well,
But
kind of echoes of Abraham and Isaac, right? Like the sacrifice
yeah, yeah, it is.
on the mountain. Abraham kind of had that same trust. Presumably Isaac did as well.
Yeah, because that next sentence, right? He's like, "Indeed, you'll see." It's kind of like he's telling everybody. It's like a Psalm 22. When we
Mhm.
talked about Jesus quoting Psalm 22 from the cross, he's like saying, "Everybody's going to see this is going to turn out for my deliverance."
Mhm.
You know, so that's kind of cool too. Um, so, so basically, like we said, chapter 13, Job telling his friends, "Shut up, let God speak for Himself. Don't try to speak for Him. You're killing me." And
Yeah.
and then here, listen to what I say, and let me defend myself. I'm trying to be faithful all the way to death.
Yeah.
So,
When God finally does join in the conversation, the first thing he says basically is, "What what are all these sounds coming out of your mouths to all of Job's friends?
Yeah.
It's
Job's
like, is
like,
this wisdom?
this is not going to play out good for you. All right. So now, like we've already introduced the topic of death, right? And so now we get to chapter 14, and Job is still talking, and he gives this little discourse about a life and death, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
You want to read that? I
Yeah.
know you like
I'll
this.
read it.
You
Yeah.
read this first part of it here?
Job 14, 7 through 12. At least there is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, it will sprout again, and its new shoots will not fail. Its roots may grow old in the ground, and its stump die in the soil. Yet at the scent of water it will bud and put forth shoots like a plant. But a man dies and is laid low. He breathes his last and is no more. As the water of a lake dries up or a riverbed becomes parched and dry, so he lies down and does not rise. Till the heavens are no more, people will not awake or be roused from their sleep. Man, I'll tell you, we had a holly tree when we moved into our house right behind the back wall, and we had it cut down and stump taken out and ground up, and somehow it's still sprouting. Like every year in the spring or summer, there's a little holly leaf sticking up, and I have to go and rip it out because I don't want that thing growing into my foundation.
Yeah.
So he's on to something.
Well, I mean, it's amazing, right? Because here he's saying, all right, we just saw in 13 that he said, I'm going to follow him even if it means I die. And here he's saying, yeah, I wish it wasn't this way, but I know that when I die, that's it. I can't do like this tree.
Mhm.
I wish that I could just I'm going to ride through this thing, even if it kills me. And then God, I'll still be alive on the other side, right?
Mhm.
He's going, but that's not the way it works with men. It doesn't matter. I'm going to do it anyway. I can't see how this is possibly going to work out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but that's just Job getting started on life and death, because amazing in 14, he continues in verses 13 through 17.
If only you would hide me in the grave and conceal me till your anger has passed. If only you would set me a time and then remember me. If someone dies, will they live again? All the days of my hard service I will wait for my renewal to come. You will call and I will answer you. You will long for the creature your hands have made. Surely then you will count my steps, but not keep track of my sin. My offenses will be sealed up in a bag. You will cover over my sin.
I mean, are we reading the New Testament right now
Yeah.
or the Old Testament? I'm like, this is the oldest literature possibly known to man. And here's Job saying, well, here's an idea. What if we could die, be buried in the ground, and all of our sins be sealed up, and then
Yeah.
we'd be raised again, and when God wakes us, it's kind of like, what
Well,
did he
and,
just
and
say?
even you will cover the sin. God covers the sin. I mean,
Yeah.
that sounds very, very much like the New Testament.
Yeah.
I love the logic of Job's argument here. He starts with saying, "You will long for the creature your hands have made." Go back to our very first, well, episode 0, but our episode 1 in Genesis, and we looked at how God keeps calling everything good. There's an order to the creation. Everything is good. At the end of every day, he says it. He saw what he had made, and he said it was good. And so that, we were talking about how these two stories, the creation story and Job, kind of circle each other, probably came out of the same oral tradition.
Well,
And that's what Job grounds the argument in, is God makes things good, which would include me, right? So why would he want me to be destroyed? Did he change his mind? Was he wrong?
yeah. And I just love the language in here, because he's like, he's dead, right? And he says, you will call and I will answer you.
Mhm.
He's like, even if I'm dead, if God calls me, I'll be able to answer. So
Well,
he's
where
like,
did everything come from in creation? From God's voice, right?
Yeah.
Demanding that there be light. Let us make man in our image, right?
yeah, I mean, even staying in the Old Testament, you have passages like in Ezekiel where he talks about the dry bones coming back to life. And God can raise a whole army up out of dried bones.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same thing like Job, as ancient as it is, we don't know, but it's a very early theological document, and it's saying the concept of resurrection is already on the table here.
Yeah.
So it's pretty fascinating. It's weird. How does Job stumble upon resurrection? Well, I mean, it's because of his unjustified suffering, right?
Hmm.
He's like, well, I mean, that's why we said the key to understanding the book in the very first verse and in two other places where God says Job's an upright person is that Job is an upright person.
Yeah.
His suffering is unjustified. In fact, everybody hates that part of the story, right? Why is Satan allowed to go and torment this guy? He didn't do anything, and everybody thinks that's just wrong. But that's the whole point of the story is like, just do the right thing. Why are you worried about the circumstances of
Yeah.
that you're called to do the right thing in?
Yeah. That's true.
Hmm.
One thing I take away from that is, um, as soon as the way that Job's belongings and family and everything are destroyed, if you go and read that for yourself, it seems to me like these were things that were all around him already. God was withholding it, and as soon as he allowed it to happen, it's like raiding bandits come in and a storm comes in.
Yeah, they're all there
Yeah,
in the first place, right?
yeah, it's all already there. Like God didn't
Hmm.
send it in. He's not causing the evil.
Hmm.
He's just withholding it, and he can choose to give it free reign at times if he wants to.
That was Satan's point.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's like, well, yeah, you comfort and protect this guy. Let him suffer the same things every normal guy
hmm,
suffers, and see how he treats you.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that's great. That's a great point.
yeah. I love the way you put that. If Job were allowed to experience what everyone else is experiencing, how would he fare? And it reminds me of something that I wrote. I wrote this poem about dealing with sin, with temptation, and there's the I was looking at this concept of how everyone kind of has their own personal vices, and it's really easy to be judgmental when you don't struggle with the vice. And I put this line in there that says, "Oh ye of little practice, how would you fare if suddenly that temptation came against you? You don't have to deal with it.
Yeah.
So for all you know, it just hasn't bothered you yet. And if it
Mm.
did, you'd fall faster than that guy who's been wrestling with it for 40 years."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I like that little phrase, "Ye of little practice." I think that's what Satan is thinking about Job. He has it
Yeah,
easy,
that's true. Yeah,
Yeah, he's not really righteous. God just coddles him.
yeah. But what I love about Job is when all those things do come and he finds himself in those circumstances, right? He dares to believe that God's going to set all these things right. He's, he's so far ahead of his friends. His friends are like, well, you're scraping sores off with a potsherd, so
Yeah,
like you're pretty much at the bottom. And
yeah.
Job's
You
like,
must not be righteous then.
yeah. And Job's like, how's God going to get me out of here? Like, he's already, like,
Hmm.
even if I die, he's going to do it. I don't know how. I know he's going to do it. I'm trying to figure it out because I don't know anything about resurrection. If I die, how's he going to do it? I don't know. If he calls me, I'll go.
Yeah,
But he's like, I can't see it. I can't envision it. It's like he conceptualizes it, but he can't understand how it could ever happen. It's kind of like where Solomon um, in in Ecclesiastes 3:11, he talks about, man, God has put eternity in man's mind, yet he cannot understand what's happened
yeah.
from the beginning to the end. It's like we know what eternity is, but we're like, I don't,
How do I get there?
yeah, I don't know. I can't tell you I can't show it to you because it's bigger than I could show you, and it's like,
Yeah,
and so since this is wisdom literature also, Job's saying kind of the same thing. He's like, I know God's going to save me. I know he's going to do it even if I die, but I don't know how.
yeah. That's like I have a friend who may or may not be listening to this. And his little girl, when she was about 5, asked him, "How do we get to heaven?" And he's like, "Okay, whoa, that's a big question." So he starts trying to put it in 5-year-old terms, and he just watched her eyes glass over. And she goes, "Does he fly us there?" And he was like, "Yeah, that'll work for now. Just trust him. Just trust him, and he'll figure it out."
Yeah.
But it's almost as if Job is in like a dark, depressing, meaningless place.
Oh, yeah,
But
the dark, empty place?
he trusts that God is going to make something better out of
Oh,
it.
he's not going to try to propose what the solution would be. He's going to let God come up with something better than he
Yeah,
could have
yeah.
imagined.
Because why would
Uh,
he?
and
Like,
Job
back to
watched
our Genesis
podcasts.
episode.
Job watched
Yeah, yeah.
podcasts back in whatever year
That's
it was.
actually the oldest thing that's ever been made is our podcast.
He's our first subscriber. Yeah.
But
So
yeah, he doesn't want to end up, if you've seen our Genesis episode, he doesn't want to end up stuck on his island with a nightlight and a bag of chips. he knows that God can make something
better.
yeah, beautiful and meaningful out of even the despair that he's in.
What I love about Job, though, is he does have a little bit of imagination too, because not only does he say, "Oh, hey, and by the way, figure out a way to save me even after I'm dead," and then he throws in the forgiveness of sins too. He's like, "And could you seal up my sins too? Because I have a problem with that. I'm trying to get rid of those too." So
Yeah,
he like throws in an extra thing. So if Job wouldn't have been the bag of chips guy,
yeah,
Job would have been like, "I want butterflies." What, he didn't make a butterfly,
yeah.
to continue to quote our episode. But so very, very amazing stuff that Job comes up with. I mean, he just
That's why I wanted that thought. Why does God consider Job blameless and upright? I wanted to circle back to it because it's not because he's without sin. Obviously, I mean, Job acknowledges his sins. He asked God to cover them,
yes,
and I think it's because of his faith in God here and his confession. Right, like there's kind of two senses of confession, and in some Christian traditions, they have like some kind of formal confession in the worship or private confession. But the word confess just means to say with, like con, usually means with when you see that at the beginning of the word. It's basically just saying with God what's true about you. And Job does all of that right there in chapter 14. Like he acknowledges that God made him good. God's going to long for the creature that his hands have made. He also acknowledges, yeah, but I also did bad things. And then he also acknowledges, but God can take care of that somehow. I don't know how,
yeah,
but he can overcome my
yeah,
sin. He can overcome death. He's confessing all these things that are true, and because it's true, because that's what
mhm,
God says about us as well,
yeah,
that we were made good, we have fallen evil, and He can still redeem us from it. That's what That's why he sees Job as righteous
yeah.
because he actually is, as Job asks, covering his sin.
Yeah, and then centuries or even millennium later, we come up with we're delivered the through revelation the ideas of baptism
Mhm.
and resurrection and so on in the New Testament, but they're based on these same
Oh yeah. Remember
discussions.
what he says there, wakes up the tree when the roots are decayed and the stump
Water,
dies in the soil,
yeah,
the scent of water.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
baptism.
right. Yeah, that's true. Very amazing.
Yeah.
So all these very advanced theological ideas, and they're coming from what could be some of the oldest, surviving, oral traditions and things that we have
Mhm.
recorded in the Bible. So, and it's just amazing. But there's more, right? And so, and I really love chapter 17. I feel like chapter 17 is kind of like the center of everything Job's trying to say, and let me explain why when we read this. Okay, so jumping into verse 6 of chapter 17, and Job says, this is chapter 17, verse 6 through 9. God has made me a byword to everyone, a man in whose face people spit. My eyes have grown dim with grief. My whole frame is but a shadow. The upright are appalled at this. The innocent are aroused against the ungodly. Nevertheless, the righteous will hold to their ways, and those with clean hands will grow stronger. And it's just like now Joe's being fairly sarcastic in this chapter, and I think
Yeah,
he's
because
like,
he's arguing with his friends.
yeah, and I think when he says, like I'm a byword to everybody, including you guys, people spit in my face, including you guys, people look down on me, including you guys, so he's like
The
everybody's against
innocent
me.
are aroused against the ungodly. I'm
Yeah,
the innocent. You guys are the.
yeah,
If you've ever seen a group of guys hang out, that's just all that's happening
yeah.
the whole time.
But then Job says, "But what am I supposed to do?" Like, okay, yeah, this is the hardest thing I've ever faced. Like Caleb said, he'd never seen these things before. And yet I'm not going to give up on being a good person, right? Like he's saying, I'm keeping my upward aim. I don't care what's happening. Shouldn't a downtrodden man be allowed to strive for righteousness too? Like, why is that just the domain of people who have everything going fine? That's really the flaw in his friend's logic, right? Is it doesn't matter what's going on in your life, you should strive for righteousness, and all Job is saying is like, at what point of bad things happening to you, are you allowed to stop trying to be a good person? Now it's like, okay, this is way too many bad things. I'm just going to give up and I'm going to just be a
Mhm.
bad person
Yeah.
now. I'm going to stop trying to be a good and righteous person.
Yeah. And it reminds me, I hadn't thought about this before. My favorite quote from the whole book of the Lord of the Rings. It's not in the movies, unfortunately. There's a character who says, "How is a man to discern between good and evil in such times as these?" Because it's chaos and war going on, you know. And another character responds and says, "The same as he ever has. Good and evil haven't changed since last year." Like it's your job to discern between them, no matter when or where you are.
Yeah.
And
And I mean, this gets back to our first two episodes also, where we talked about, there's either a downward spiral or an upward spiral.
mhm,
And God's world spirals up. I mean, a world centered on God, a life centered on God spirals up. And, when you walk away from God, that's when things spiral down. And we talked, I know that Jordan Peterson is the champion of this now. He's a champion of the Book of Job. He's a
yeah.
champion of the spiral up and spiral down.
Yeah,
Bottomless pit of
he did one
hell.
on Job as well.
He hasn't released like a series on Job yet, but he talks about Job all the
Okay.
time and then the ultimate suffering and how that's a model for the Christian
Yeah.
uh, experience too. But he Jonah and Job are two of his go
Yeah.
to things. But
Jonah's almost the opposite. He's just like complaining the whole way. Has to be dragged against his will.
yeah, that's true. But
Um,
just as instructive, right? So
yeah. Well, I was gonna say, I mean, I hadn't made really any of these connections going through the notes and preparing for this, and now that we're in it, we just keep referencing the God of Creation episode, the first one, and now
yeah,
with the downward and upward spiral, and it makes so much sense because, like you were saying at the beginning of the episode, those probably both came from oral traditions among the Hebrews first before they were written,
yeah,
and I mean, it makes sense that you kind of juxtapose them. Well, what did he deal with first, the origin or the suffering? Maybe that's the wrong question. Like maybe they depend on each other.
oh, that's a great
Yeah.
great
I mean, because
belief. Yeah.
again, what did I say? Job seems to ground his argument
Mhm.
in God creating him as something good.
Well, what is creation but an upward aim anyway?
Yeah.
It's God's upward aim for all of us. He's aiming up. He's making something, like we said, is more gratuitously wonderful than we would have asked for.
Yeah.
And yet we sit around depressed and say, "Oh, there's nothing to do." Yeah.
Mm.
Great. All right. So now, like I said, Job's being sarcastic in chapter 17. So here, picking up in verses 10 through 16, he says, "But come on, all of you, try again," speaking to his friends. "I will not find a wise man among you. My days have passed. My plans are shattered. Yet the desires of my heart turn night into day. In the face of the darkness, light is near. If the only home I hope for is the grave, if I spread out my bed in the realms of darkness, if I say to corruption, 'You are my father,' and to the worm, 'My mother,' or 'My sister,' where then is my hope? Who can see any hope for me? Will it go down to the gates of death? Will we descend together into the dust?" So it's just this. I mean, Job is just refuses to give up on hope. He's like, "No, hope never dies. Hope doesn't go down to the grave. Like, God will save me from the grave, and it would be wrong to let hope die," is what Job's saying. Remember, his wife told him very on at the beginning, before his friends even showed up, like, just curse God and die.
Hmm.
And Job's still arguing now with his friends, like, "I am never going to let go of hope."
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking, it sounds like he prefaces all that with mocking his friends. He's like, "Look, my entire life is ruined. I'm kind of more disappointed that you guys are so dumb."
Yeah.
He's saying, "Look, here
So,
I am in the ashes of all my possessions, and I still have hope. And,
I,
and you guys look at me from your comparatively, luxurious position, and you're just like, oh, I guess there's no hope."
well,
He
it's,
says,
it's
"If there's no hope for me, then there's no hope for you
It's like you said earlier, maybe letting him keep his wife was more of a punishment than a blessing. And
and his
maybe
friends."
his
Yeah,
friends are just as bad. His friends is like, "Oh, and he has the worst friends in the world." So,
yeah,
yeah. Oh, man. Okay. So we're almost done with the sections we wanted to share with you. We got one more from Job 19. Like I said, we've already covered the heart of what Job's argument is.
hmm
But 19 is just another one of those amazingly advanced theology sections here. And why don't you read Job
yeah.
19, 23 through 27?
It's hard to believe that this is written before Christ,
Yeah,
when you
yeah.
when you see this. But that's undeniable that it was. I mean, from a historical standpoint, there's no way that it wasn't. This is Job 19:23 through 27. Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead or engraved in rock forever. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me.
That's just amazing.
Yeah. Uh, I like at the beginning there. I like how we talked about how rare literacy was back then. This is an oral tradition. So in this oral tradition poem, potentially, they have an appeal to literacy already. We need to write it on a scroll. We need to inscribe it on lead. We need to engrave it in a rock forever.
So now this is one of the passages. I didn't talk about this earlier, but I'm happy to talk about it now. That is argues for a later date for Job, that it was written in the post-exilic
Oh yeah.
period because of the Behistun inscription that was made by Darius, our old buddy Darius
Hmm.
from Ezra and Nehemiah there. Um, so so he
Well, yeah,
made
and like you were saying, a lot of writing, like paper and vellum, hadn't even been developed in that early period.
for common people,
It's
sure.
entirely possible that with a poem, like an oral poem like that some things could be added on, especially by the time it was written down, that they might have added to it.
That's true. But the Behistun inscription is I'll put a picture up on the screen here to show you. It is a giant inscription that was written on cliff walls, and it was made by driving metal, lead and metal pins into the wall,
Hmm.
and so yeah, it was really really cool. But yeah, that was Darius, and that was one of the keys to you know translating various languages or coming up with interpretation of languages because they were able to compare different languages that were on the wall
Hmm.
there, I think. And
It's
okay,
like the early Rosetta Stone.
yeah. So Job expects to be redeemed here, even if it's after his own death. He's like, well, I may be like
Yeah.
skeleton, but I'll still see this with my own eyes. It's amazing.
Yeah. The only thing he doesn't foresee, I guess, is that God himself will go down to be destroyed,
Yeah.
down to the grave, in order to redeem him and everyone else.
Yeah, yeah. He
Yeah.
doesn't have the mechanism there, but he has
But
the
I mean,
concept.
if I feel like if you took those verses and read them um, to someone who wasn't a Christian, even to some Jews. I have seen like online videos where somebody reads verses from Isaiah that prophesy Christ, and the Jews are like, "Well, don't read from your New Testament. Read from our common scriptures." Like, yeah, this is. I feel like no one would believe you. Oh, you've got some kind of a trick Bible there.
Yeah.
That has to come after Jesus.
Okay, so that kind of wraps up the Old Testament study for this episode, and we've seen that Job has some really advanced theology for what we're used to seeing in the Old Testament, and that ultimately Job is demanding the right to aim up. Right? He's saying, even though I am downtrodden, even though I'm in the lowest point of my life, I should still aim up and strive for righteousness.
You might
So.
say that he feels the confidence to approach the throne of God.
Yeah.
That's our last episode. That's what we
Mhm.
took away from Esther. And
Mhm.
Job says, I mean, what did he say? He says, no godless person would dare come before him.
That's true. Yeah,
And
that's a cool verse. Yeah, we read
I
that
mean,
one.
it's the Bible's not arranged chronologically. Like we were saying, this might actually be the oldest story that the Hebrews were telling, and we had to jump back and forth some in Chronicles. But Job comes right after Esther. That was our takeaway from Esther, and that's kind of what Job is begging for. I just want to talk to God. I just
Yeah,
want to. I
that's
just want
true.
to come before Him
That's true.
and talk about it man to man, so to speak.
Yeah, so that gets us to our Old Testament takeaway, which is God will lead us to righteousness no matter what the circumstances. So,
Yeah, and it's easy to say that, right? I mean, it's easy to say. One of our biggest points has been going back to that Genesis episode when we're in a dark, empty place, to have faith, to have hope. It's easy to say that. It's a lot harder to do it.
yeah.
And Job is saying, yeah, even if it goes beyond hope, like down to the grave, I'm still going to hope in God.
Yeah, I mean, Job's putting Christians who have New Testaments to shame by believing it even without his New
Hmm.
Testament. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and basically, so that's the message of Job is trust God no matter what the circumstances are, even all the way to death. And this is similar to our temptation episode because what Job is really saying is that God would never lead me away from his presence,
Hmm.
right? And that was what we said in
Yeah.
when we were talking about temptation. We were saying God is not the one who's going to lead you away. He's always going to lead you back toward him. And here, Job is basically saying the same thing. Like, I know that God wouldn't actively work for my ill. He would only work for me. Everything spirals up with God. And
Hmm.
so I'm just going to keep aiming up because that's where I was aimed before.
Yeah.
Let's turn to the New Testament and see if we can find these themes there.
Something tells me we will.
Remember the title of our series is "Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him?" And what we do is go through the Old Testament, find these themes, and then we go to the New and show how they carry all the way through, and most of the time, and including this episode, all the way through the Book of Revelation. These themes about overcoming death and suffering, ultimate suffering, and leading to being justified by God. And so, what did Jesus teach about following God in life and in death? Right? I mean, that was his
Mhm.
whole ministry.
Yeah.
So, what did he teach about overcoming death itself? Right? He didn't just teach about that, he modeled it.
Yeah. That's the important thing. That's like
Yeah.
that's what we were saying. The one thing it doesn't seem like Job predicted
Yeah.
was
That
that
he
God
would.
would just come and do it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. So he went to the cross, Jesus did, in full faith of being justified after death. And it's exactly the same as what Job, and then like I mentioned Jordan Peterson, and what he says about Job and says, that it's the precursor to Christ. It's
Hmm.
the the ultimately good person suffering the most, infamous and terrible death, and then the justification that comes after that. So
Yeah.
and
Um,
oh, go ahead.
I know you're about to introduce the first New Testament verse, but
Hmm. Yeah.
the whole time that I was reading through the verses here, for Job, and I hadn't made it to the because he's had these put together roughly for years. He's taught him before,
10 or
so
15. Yeah.
yeah. So I was going through the notes in Job. I hadn't made it to the New Testament yet, and every single one I was thinking of the verse where Jesus says what he's about to say here. So I wrote in my notes that the whole book of Job is screaming for this verse, screaming for God to say what Jesus says here in John 12.
Mm.
And the context for this verse, by the way, Jesus has already had the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and then a bunch of Greeks come and ask him, and that's interesting too, because speaking of like a righteous man who's wrongfully condemned by everybody, if you're not familiar with the story of Socrates, he was in a similar boat. Of course, he's not as righteous as Christ, but he was basically a well-meaning and wise guy in Athens, and all the other important guys got mad because he was smarter than them, and was making their sons doubt them.
Yeah.
So they condemned him to death, and so that's interesting that the Greeks are the ones who come and ask about this. I think.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, we've already read this verse back in our Second Chronicles episode that was entitled "Born Again," where we talked about Reformation in the Old Testament and,
Hmm.
and being born again in the New. And um, but uh, here, this is that familiar story about how a seed can't become a plant unless it's planted in the ground,
Hmm.
right? So you want to read it since you're excited about this?
Yes, and also with that imagery of that Job had of the tree dying and still sprouting again, we have
Yeah.
more of that plant imagery.
Yeah.
So, all right, Jesus replied to the Greeks, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour." That sounds like Esther, you know.
And Job.
Yeah, but for this, it's for this that you've been brought into the world.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it and will glorify it again. The crowd that was there heard it and said it had thundered. Others said an angel had spoken to him. Jesus said, "This voice was for your benefit, not mine." In other words, yeah, I already know that. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. The crowd spoke up. "We have heard from the law that the Messiah will remain forever. So how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man?" Then Jesus told them, "You are going to have the light just a little while longer. Walk while you have the light before darkness overtakes you. Whoever walks in the dark does not know where they are going. Believe in the light while you have the light, so that you may become children of light." When he had finished speaking, Jesus left and hid himself from them.
So there's there's a ton of stuff in this.
Yeah.
Like I said, we've talked about it before. So especially the first part of it. But a couple of things, to emphasize again: a seed can't, unless it dies, it can't become a plant. So that's the main point, right? But then, like Jesus has some other little nuggets in here, like how love for this life can keep you from following Him.
Hmm.
You know, um, and he talks about that. And then he says, but God will justify all who follow Jesus no matter what. So those are some of the themes that are in this. And then of course the people, they kind of play the part of Job's friends,
Yeah.
Jesus says some stuff and then they say something dumb, like, well, I thought Messiah would live forever, because that's what they thought. And Jesus is like, okay.
So you're willing to believe that a guy will live forever, but not that he could die and then be raised back from the
Yeah.
dead?
Yeah.
That would be too much of a stretch.
Yeah. So so he talks about these things in here. Anyone who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. And so it's kind of the things that Job was saying. I'm not going to love this life so much that I stop aiming for righteousness.
Mhm,
I'm going to trust God all the way to the point of death. And Jesus is saying, go ahead and trust Him beyond.
mhm. Yeah, just like Job. Even if even if my flesh rots,
Hmm.
sees corruption,
Yeah.
decay in the grave, these same eyes will see him.
Yeah. It's amazing. All right. So now we talked about here with the stump, that sprouts back, and now we want to look in Romans 11, and this is a lengthier reading also. So I'll go ahead and read it. It's a Romans 11 through 24. Again, I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. So here Paul is talking about Jews who have fallen away and how they failed to maintain the kingdom of God and so is given to the Gentiles. And he continues in verse 12. But if their transgression means riches for the world and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? I am talking to you, Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I take pride in my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. For if their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this: you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted. But they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand because of faith. Do not be arrogant, but tremble. For if God did not spare the natural branches, He will not spare you either. Consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree?
So kind of confusing and, a lot of allegory there.
Yeah,
But yeah, he is talking about the ethnic nation of Israel and against the church. It's a good verse to throw against like an anti-Semite if they're a Christian. And there's been plenty of that in Christian history, unfortunately. But yeah, again, we have the imagery of the plant here. I mean, it sounds a lot like the vine and the branches, right? And God is pruning here, like we've talked about.
yeah,
Certainly scary in verse 22 when he says, if you do not continue in his kindness, you also will be cut off.
hmm. yeah.
A bit of a judgment there.
Well, if the original branch was pruned, right, then how
Yeah.
much more the sown in
Yeah.
branch? But
There's
yeah,
a warning there against falling away from the faith.
yeah. I mean, you know, he does make the point though, like a lot like Job said, that a dead branch that had already been cut off the tree could be grafted back in,
Hmm.
and God can justify anyone who has faith, right? That's what he says. That in that verse where he said, um, let's see, they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand because of faith. And he said those branches can be grafted back in also.
Hmm.
So any branch, but it's just kind of like the Naomi example from Ruth,
Yeah.
where Naomi was cut off from Israel and she was completely out, and then she was kind of grafted back in
Yeah.
through the
Yeah.
kinsman redeemer.
That's a
And
really good
yeah,
point. Yeah, I keep thinking with all this imagery. I meant to bring this up with Job when he talks about the tree. He's like, even a tree when it dies can still sprout again. I remember thinking of when Jesus talks about the flowers of the field and the birds of the air. That the flowers are clothed better than Solomon, and
yeah,
the birds don't sow or reap, but they have plenty to eat because God looks after them, and not one of them dies without Him knowing about it. And then He says, "Are you not more precious to Him than sparrows?" And I think Job is saying the same thing. Am I not more precious to God than a tree? So
yeah,
if he can
yeah,
keep this tree alive after dying, then he can do the same for me.
yeah. That's cool. All right. So moving on to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 20 through 26. Caleb.
Yeah. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam we all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. But each in turn, Christ the firstfruits, then when he comes, those who belong to him. Then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death.
All right. So good news, Job.
Yeah,
There's no more death.
that's awesome.
Yeah. And this talks about the first fruits, and we've talked about a seed going into the ground, and then coming up and then making more seeds. And it's not only does it become a different plant after it's planted, but then it produces even more seeds than you had in the first place. And this is kind of talking about the same thing here.
Well, this is I think kind of an answer to, well, why do we have to wait? Why do we die and we're still dealing with suffering and death now? Because Christ is the first fruits, right? That they all have to, all of those seeds have to die to be sown, be planted, and then Christ is the first. And it says that the end will come when he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power, put all his enemies under his feet. But the last enemy to be destroyed is death. It says.
Mm.
So we're still kind of waiting on the fulfillment of that.
Yeah. That's why there's passages in the New Testament that say death has no mastery over you anymore, because death itself will be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason we can follow Christ all the way to death, because Death means nothing to us. And that leads us into the book of Revelation, chapter 20, verses 11 through 14. It says, "Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire." Okay, so this is the famous final judgment.
Yeah.
So,
Where death itself is killed.
yeah, it's amazing.
Death dies.
So, you want to be written in that book of life, I think?
Yeah, it would seem like it.
But,
I think it's interesting. It says that the you're being judged by what's in the books. So this is kind of Job is acknowledging his own sin, right? Like we talked about,
mhm,
but asking that God will cover over it.
yeah,
So you know, obviously our sins would still be there. We can still be judged by them. But if we're written in the book of life, if we're covered with Christ, right? If we've put Him on, um, then we're Paul talks about being putting on Christ in baptism. So if we're clothed with Him, then He's covering over the sin.
yeah, and I love the idea of books, like you said. You've mentioned in the past how much you love
Didn't
books
Job want his words to be written in
in an iron pen.
yeah, that would last forever?
Yeah. Well, and this whole thing about books, like as a historian, and you've talked about how you love books, you love reading your favorite people or authors, and you think of things in terms of that. And here, it's kind of like an analogy for all of history, right?
Hmm.
It's like everything is written down. There, you're not going to escape the thing that you did to that person that you think nobody knows about. Whatever. I mean, everything's been written down in the books, and there's a permanent record. And so, it's kind of like to give you a little bit of pause. It would probably be good to make things right with your creator, you know,
Yeah.
and before this moment. So, any other
Yeah.
thoughts?
There's also I like Revelation 1:18 where Jesus says that He holds the keys of death and Hades. Like
Yeah.
He unlocked them, and they can't be locked again because he's got the keys.
The same keys that he talked to Peter about.
Yeah. C.S. Lewis has the idea that hell is locked from the inside. I mean, a lot of people have talked about that, but I know it from him. That the people who are in there want to be. We've
Oh,
talked
yeah,
about if you
yeah.
don't like God, you're not going to like heaven. 'Cause
Right.
that's just being in His presence.
Yeah, you're trying to keep yourself away from him. Yeah.
Yeah, and it talks about that there that the earth and heavens tried to flee from God, but there was no place for them.
Yeah, God doesn't have to force them to out of his presence. They don't want to be with him
Yeah.
anyway.
So I mean, Christ wants
Mhm.
you to come out of death and Hades.
Yes.
He wants to save us from that.
Yeah.
It's we can willingly choose it.
Yeah.
But like Job says, he doesn't. Even when he dies, he knows that he can come out of it, and he'll see his Savior again.
hmm So that leads us to our New Testament takeaway, which is faith in Jesus Christ leads us through death and into life. So,
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember is that he leads by example, right?
mhm.
And that's why his answer to that question was that the seed has to die in order for him to become the first fruits. He also has to die along with us. So he leads us through death himself. He actually goes through
Mm.
it with us.
And he conquers it for us, really.
Yes.
Yeah. And, that's the thing about God. His power is not limited to this world alone, right? And neither are we limited to this world alone, but we don't think of ourselves that way. Like Job was trapped in that, physical mindset. He was like, how is this going to work?
Hmm.
How is it that God's going to do this? I don't know, but he's going to. And the way he does that is because we actually are spiritual beings with physical bodies,
Hmm.
you know?
Well,
And
that's like we
it's
talked about in the episodes about the temple, that there's not as strong a division, I think, between physical and spiritual. Like
mhm.
that there's kind of a false dichotomy. You have like the Gnostic approach, which is like, okay, all physical is bad and all spiritual is good. And then you have kind of the opposite, like a, um, what's the word? A pantheism, where it's like, oh, it's all really just one thing. They are two separate things, but they're tied together, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I really like this because we're getting to where Job was. I mean, Job was really saying, "Look, my life is bigger than what's happening to me in this world,"
Hmm.
and that's what the New Testament teaches. That's what following Christ means. Why can you follow Him to death? Because your life in this world is not all there is to your life. It's bigger than that. And I think sometimes, like the person on the island with the flashlight and the bag of chips, that we were
Yeah.
talking about, we're not that guy. We're not the guy who's just stuck in this lousy world, right? We're the guy that's overcome this world, like we've talked about in so many of our other episodes. Overcoming the world, like we talked about in the Joshua episode, how we're more than conquerors, because we've conquered death through Christ.
Yeah, I mentioned how I liked that Job grounds his argument in God's creation of him. He kind of finishes the argument in chapter 17, right? When he says that his eyes, not anyone else will see God, and he finishes it by saying, "How my heart yearns within me."
Mhm.
So he's also appealing to his desire. There's an argument. There's an argument for God from desire, and that's like we were talking about in the creation episode, right? That I believe that's when I quoted C.S. Lewis as saying that we often think of our desires as too strong and we have to subdue them, and God thinks they're too weak.
Yeah,
You
and we
know?
talked about it again in our temptation episode.
Yeah,
We were talking
and
about, desire is not the problem.
and Job is saying,
It's
where do I have this desire for eternity? Why do I have that?
Mhm.
Where does that come from if God's not going to fulfill it somehow?
Yeah. Yeah, it's because your life is bigger than just the life in this world. And Christ, is it's like when we've talked about this so many different episodes. It's like when we talked about Elisha and his servant, and it's like, okay, all you're seeing is this army. You need some spiritual vision here, buddy.
Hmm.
Like you need to see the other army. So he lets him see it. Well, we know, just like Job figured out, that life is bigger than just this world. And that's feeling that spiritual root that we have. We talked about seeds and plants and all this. We have a spiritual root that goes well beyond. A tree has a root that goes well beyond what you can see of the tree. And that's kind of the way our lives are. We're rooted in a spiritual being, and we have a manifestation above ground here that people see, you know.
Hmm.
Uh, but we need to maintain that root and foundation in God. It's kind of like having a dual citizenship, like you're a citizen in heaven, you're a citizen of earth. And, there are plenty of passages that talk about that. You can go read like in Ephesians 2 or Colossians 3, where it talks about that being seated in heaven with Christ in Ephesians and so on. But yeah, so how does somebody become a citizen in heaven, Caleb?
Well, we've already mentioned it, putting on Christ in baptism,
Yeah.
right? That's how, you get covered by him, like Job begs for his sins to be covered.
Hmm.
That's how your name's put in the book of life. I've quoted it probably in more than the majority of our episodes. Romans 6, Paul says that anyone who's baptized in Christ has been put to death with Christ. Like our hope is in his death, even
Yeah.
deeper than Job realized. We actually need that, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
If
Death's part of the
Jesus
solution.
says, if you cling to this life, you're not going to get it. It's
Yeah.
only when you give it up and you just dive in, you follow him into the grave,
Yeah.
in his death and hope in his resurrection.
Yeah. Beautifully said. So that's all we have for this episode. He's Caleb, and I'm Timothy. And thank you for listening to Bible discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel to help support our efforts. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2024 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.